Imagine standing on Fifth Avenue in New York City in the year 1885. Mansions rise like palaces, glittering with marble staircases, gold chandeliers, and velvet curtains. Carriages roll past, carrying women draped in diamonds and men in tuxedos who sip champagne beneath ceilings painted with frescoes. To the casual observer, this was America's golden age, a time when wealth seemed limitless and progress unstoppable. But take just a few steps away from those grand avenues, and the scene changes. The glow of chandeliers gives way to the dim flicker of kerosene lamps. Tenement buildings groan under the weight of immigrant families crammed into single rooms. Children cough in the smog-filled air. Factory workers trudge home with soot on their faces, and hunger gnaws at millions. This was the reality hidden beneath the shine. The writer Mark Twain, with his usual sharp wit, gave this era its most fitting name, the Gilded Age. He chose gilded because gold only covered the surface, underneath lay cheap metal, brittle and flawed. It was an age of contradictions. A handful of men, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, amassed fortunes so vast that kings of Europe envied them. They built railroads that spanned continents, industries that fueled modern life, and banks that decided the fate of nations. Their names became synonymous with wealth itself. Yet while they dined on caviar, their workers survived on pennies. While they built mansions fit for emperors, their factories became cages of fire and steel. The newspapers praised them as captains of industry, but their critics had another name, robber barons. The Gilded Age was not just about money, it was about power. It was about the way wealth could bend democracy, silence reform, and redraw the very rules of society. The glittering ballrooms were only one side of the story. The other side was darker, bloodier, and far more human. This is the story of America's golden illusion, the age when wealth dazzled the world, even as it nearly broke the nation. The Gilded Age was fueled by a single, unstoppable force, industrialization. After the Civil War, America surged forward with an energy unlike anything the world had seen. Railroads carved across the continent, linking farms to cities, raw materials to factories, and factories to markets. Steel, coal, and oil became the lifeblood of this new America. And standing at the helm of these industries were men whose names would become legends, and sometimes curses. John D. Rockefeller turned oil into an empire with Standard Oil, controlling nearly every drop of fuel that lit American lamps. Andrew Carnegie mastered steel, producing the beams that built the nation's bridges and skyscrapers. Cornelius Vanderbilt ruled the railroads, commanding the very arteries of commerce. And J. P. Morgan, the titan of finance, didn't just control banks, he controlled the men who controlled industries. Their rise wasn't simply luck. These men operated with ruthless efficiency, crushing competition through monopolies, secret deals, and sometimes outright intimidation. Rockefeller famously cut deals with railroads to sabotage rivals, while Carnegie squeezed his steelworkers to increase profits. Morgan, with his vast capital, acted as a one-man Federal Reserve long before such an institution existed, bailing out, or buying out, failing companies and consolidating industries under his control. To their admirers, they were the embodiment of the American dream, proof that hard work and vision could turn rags into riches. But critics saw something darker, a small circle of men who bent the rules of capitalism until it no longer looked like freedom, but like feudalism. Still, there was no denying the sheer scale of their success. By the 1890s, Rockefeller's wealth alone rivaled that of entire nations. Carnegie's steel mills produced more metal than all of Great Britain. Vanderbilt's railroads didn't just move goods, they moved the very pulse of America. And Morgan, with a single phone call, could decide whether Wall Street collapsed or survived. For ordinary Americans, the scale of this wealth was almost unimaginable. It created a gulf between rich and poor so wide that even the grand palaces of Europe seemed modest in comparison. The Gilded Age wasn't just rich, it was obscenely rich, and the concentration of money in so few hands would change the course of the nation forever. If wealth was the fuel of the Gilded Age, extravagance was its display. The newly rich, eager to prove their dominance, competed not just in boardrooms but in ballrooms. Nowhere was this more obvious than on New York's Fifth Avenue, where rows of marble mansions rose like palaces, each more ostentatious than the last. The Vanderbilts, for instance, spent millions on parties so extravagant that newspapers dubbed them the social events of the century. Guests arrived in carriages glittering with gold trim, stepping into halls decorated with imported silks, rare paintings, and chandeliers that could blind the unprepared eye. Caviar, champagne, and lobster were served in endless supply, while orchestras played beneath ceilings painted with heavenly frescoes. These events were not mere gatherings, they were statements, declarations that America's elite had surpassed even the aristocracies of Europe. Beyond New York, Newport, Rhode Island became the playground of the wealthy. Along its shoreline, families built summer cottages that dwarfed European castles. The breakers, built by the Vanderbilts, boasted 70 rooms, marble imported from Italy, and ceilings gilded in gold leaf. For these magnates, no expense was too great, no indulgence too extreme. They lived like modern kings, creating a new American aristocracy that had no crowns but wore wealth as its throne. The newspapers of the time reveled in these displays. The rich were portrayed as glamorous, their lives like something out of fairy tales. For ordinary Americans, reading about such excess provided both fascination and fury. While many admired the splendor, others saw hypocrisy. These millionaires claimed to be self-made men, yet they lived behind walls that shut out the very workers who made their fortunes possible. In their shining halls, it seemed as if poverty, struggle, and injustice did not exist. But outside those marble gates, the reality of America was very different. And it was only a matter of time before that contrast erupted into outrage. While the wealthy waltzed beneath golden chandeliers, the rest of America lived in shadows. The very workers who built the railroads, mined the coal, and forged the steel that powered the fortunes of the elite were often trapped in misery. Tenement houses in New York and Chicago became symbols of this reality. Families of 6, sometimes 10, crammed into single, airless rooms where sewage seeped through cracked floors and disease spread like wildfire. Tuberculosis, cholera, and influenza claimed countless lives, and for many, simply surviving to the next week felt like a victory. For children, childhood was often stolen away. Instead of playing in parks, they worked in textile mills or crawled into dangerous coal shafts. Their tiny hands perfect for fixing machinery but at great risk of being mangled or crushed, the contrast was staggering. While Vanderbilt's guests feasted on lobster and champagne, poor families in the same city struggled to afford bread. Strikes and protests erupted as workers demanded fair wages and humane conditions. Yet when they raised their voices, they were often met with violence. Police and even private militias hired by the wealthy suppressed these uprisings with brutal force, leaving a trail of blood on the streets of industrial cities. Newspapers painted workers as troublemakers, while the rich framed themselves as saviors of industry. This divide wasn't just about money, it was about power. The Gilded Age elite controlled not only wealth but also politics, bending laws to their advantage. Their fortunes were built on the backs of millions who remained invisible, silent, and expendable. To the poor, the glittering world of marble mansions was less a dream and more a taunt, a reminder that the system was rigged against them. The Gilded Age, beneath its golden surface, was an age of suffering, an age where the American dream was a privilege, not a promise. If wealth was the crown of the Gilded Age, corruption was its scepter. The industrial titans didn't just build railroads and oil refineries, they built empires of influence that stretched straight into the halls of government. Politicians and magnates operated in a revolving door of favors, bribes, and backroom deals. It wasn't unusual for senators to openly defend monopolies in exchange for campaign contributions, or for judges to rule in favor of corporations that quietly lined their pockets. America was advertised as a democracy, but in reality, it was often the private playground of the rich. At the heart of this corruption was Tammany Hall, the political machine that ruled New York City with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. Figures like Boss Tweed became infamous for siphoning millions from public funds while ensuring the city's wealthy elite kept their grip on power. In Washington, the reach of tycoons like Rockefeller and Carnegie was just as pervasive. They lobbied aggressively to crush regulations, weaken labor protections, and secure tax breaks that preserved their dominance. J.P. Morgan, in particular, was said to have more sway over the economy than the president himself, even orchestrating bailouts for the U.S. government during financial crises. For ordinary citizens, it felt as though the system was bought and sold, because it was. Elections were influenced not by the will of the people, but by the wallets of the powerful. Corruption wasn't a side effect of the Gilded Age, it was the very engine that kept the golden machine running. The gilding that covered America's surface wasn't just gold leaf, it was the grease of politics, smeared by those who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. If corruption greased the wheels of power, monopolies drove the engine forward. By the late 19th century, competition was more myth than reality. Giants like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan didn't just dominate their industries, they owned them. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled over 90% of America's oil refineries, giving him the power to dictate prices, crush rivals, and influence global markets. His secret deals with railroads ensured competitors couldn't survive, turning the oil business into a fortress guarded by his wealth. Carnegie's steel empire was no different, supplying the raw backbone of America's skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan became the silent hand behind banking and finance. Orchestrating mergers that created colossal corporations like U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar company, to ordinary Americans, monopolies felt like invisible monarchs. You couldn't light a lamp, build a house, or deposit a paycheck without passing through the hands of these titans. The very necessities of life were controlled by men whose power rivaled kings. And unlike elected officials, these men owed nothing to the people. Their loyalty was only to profit. Critics dubbed them robber barons, men who pillaged wealth from society while presenting themselves as heroic builders of progress. They argued that monopolies strangled innovation, silenced small businesses, and locked workers into cycles of dependency, but to the magnates themselves, their dominance was natural, even righteous. Rockefeller famously claimed that his empire was simply the survival of the fittest. They saw themselves not as thieves but as visionaries, bringing order to chaos and building industries that made America the richest nation in the world. Whether saviors or tyrants, their grip on the economy was unshakable. In the Gilded Age, to challenge a monopoly was to challenge the very backbone of the nation itself, a battle most dared not fight. As the grip of the monopolies tightened, not everyone remained silent. A new wave of voices rose against the unchecked power of the robber barons. Workers, reformers, and journalists began to challenge the glittering illusion of the Gilded Age, exposing the suffering hidden beneath its golden surface. Strikes swept across the nation as workers demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair wages. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 paralyzed the nation, with thousands of workers walking off the job. In cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago, the protests turned violent as state militias and federal troops were deployed to crush dissent, leaving scores dead and hundreds wounded. These battles revealed a harsh truth: in the war between labor and capital, the government often sided with the wealthy, yet workers were not alone. A new breed of investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, took up the fight with words. Writers like Ida Tarbell exposed the ruthless tactics of Rockefeller's Standard Oil, peeling away the layers of respectability to reveal cutthroat monopolistic schemes. Newspapers and illustrated magazines published shocking images of child labor, urban poverty, and political corruption, forcing the public to confront realities they could no longer ignore. Reformers like Jacob Riis, with his groundbreaking work How the Other Half Lives, used photography to document the misery of tenement life, making the suffering of the poor impossible to deny. For the first time, the wealthy elite faced not just envy but outrage. The myth of the benevolent industrialist began to crack as Americans questioned whether progress built on exploitation was progress at all. The dissenting voices didn't topple the robber barons overnight, but they planted seeds of reform, regulation, and resistance that would one day grow into major changes in American society. In the Gilded Age, even whispers of dissent could echo like thunder. Regardless of motive, the impact was undeniable. Philanthropy changed the American landscape, creating universities, museums, and hospitals that endure to this day. Yet the question lingered, could philanthropy ever erase the exploitation that created such wealth in the first place? To critics, the answer was clear. For every library built, there were thousands of workers who had lived and died in poverty, their sacrifices fueling the fortunes that now funded these gifts. The age of philanthropy was not the end of the story, it was another gilded layer, polished to distract from the cracks beneath. Facing mounting criticism, many of the Gilded Age elite attempted to rewrite their legacy, not through policy, but through philanthropy. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller began giving away portions of their colossal fortunes, framing themselves as guardians of progress rather than oppressors of the poor. Carnegie, who once crushed strikes with armed guards, penned the Gospel of Wealth, a manifesto arguing that the rich had a moral duty to use their money for the greater good. He built over 2,500 public libraries across the United States and funded universities, cultural institutions, and scientific research. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil empire was infamous for its ruthless tactics, poured millions into the creation of the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation, and medical research that would save countless lives, but this generosity came with controversy. For many critics, philanthropy was less about compassion and more about control. By deciding where to invest their wealth, magnates shaped education, science, and culture in ways that kept their names etched into history. Carnegie's libraries bore his name, Rockefeller's foundations carried his legacy, and Morgan's art collections became permanent fixtures of American culture. Some saw these acts as noble, evidence that America's wealthiest were finally giving back. Others saw them as an attempt to cleanse blood-stained hands, buying redemption with charitable checks. Regardless of motive, the impact was undeniable. Philanthropy changed the American landscape, creating universities, museums, and hospitals that endure to this day. Yet the question lingered, could philanthropy ever erase the exploitation that created such wealth in the first place? To critics, the answer was clear. For every library built, there were thousands of workers who had lived and died in poverty, their sacrifices fueling the fortunes that now funded these gifts. The age of philanthropy was not the end of the story, it was another gilded layer, polished to distract from the cracks beneath. For all its splendor, the Gilded Age rested on fragile foundations. Beneath the marble mansions and stock market booms lurked instability that could shatter overnight. The economy of the late 19th century was marked by violent cycles of boom and bust. When times were good, fortunes multiplied at dizzying speed. But when panic struck, the glitter peeled away, revealing an economy balanced on quicksand. The Panic of 1873 and later the Panic of 1893 sent shockwaves across the nation, triggering bank failures, mass unemployment, and widespread despair. Factories shut their doors, railroads collapsed, and millions of workers were left hungry, jobless, and homeless. The very titans who preached progress often became the saviors in these moments of chaos. J.P. Morgan famously stepped in during the Panic of 1907, using his immense personal fortune to stabilize Wall Street and rescue failing banks. Newspapers painted him as a hero, but critics saw something more sinister, one man wielding more power than the U.S. government itself. If America's survival depended on the whims of a private banker, what did that say about democracy? The gilded exterior had cracked, and through those cracks, Americans glimpsed the uncomfortable truth. Wealth wasn't just concentrated, it was dangerously centralized. The crashes also deepened public resentment. For the poor, these financial panics weren't abstract market corrections, they were devastating blows that ripped apart families and futures. Strikes grew larger, protests more radical, and whispers of socialism and anarchism began to ripple through working-class neighborhoods. The Gilded Age's promise of boundless opportunity now looked like a mirage, available only to the privileged few. The facade was crumbling, and even the most dazzling philanthropy couldn't fully cover the scars. The Gilded Age may have ended in the early 20th century, but its fingerprints remain etched into America's DNA. The wealth, corruption, and inequality of that era forced the nation to reckon with questions that still echo today: who truly holds the power, the people, or the wealthy elite? Out of the cracks of the Gilded Age came the Progressive Era, a wave of reforms designed to break monopolies, regulate industries, and give workers a voice. Antitrust laws, labor protections, and the rise of unions all found their roots in the backlash against the unchecked dominance of Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. The government, for the first time, began to see itself not only as a protector of business but as a referee for the people. Yet even as reforms chipped away at the robber barons' empires, the myths of the Gilded Age endured. The skyscrapers, railroads, and cultural institutions built during this period became permanent symbols of progress. The names Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan are still etched on universities, museums, and foundations, their legacies as much philanthropic as they are exploitative. To some, they remain visionaries who built modern America; to others, they are reminders of a time when greed and power trampled over justice and equality. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Gilded Age is its warning. Wealth, when concentrated in too few hands, can reshape not only economies but entire societies. The glitter of progress can hide the darkness of exploitation, and philanthropy can polish over injustice without ever erasing it. The Gilded Age was more than just a chapter in history; it was a mirror, reflecting both the heights of human ambition and the depths of human greed. And as we look at the world today, with billionaires shaping politics, technology, and even global markets, we are left to wonder: are we living through a new Gilded Age, dressed in different clothes but built on the same foundation of wealth and inequality?